Where are you watching this from? Are you from New York, London, maybe São Paulo? Wherever you are, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button because this story will completely change how you see the people around you. Now, let me tell you about the night that transformed Manhattan's most arrogant millionaire forever. The crystal chandelier in Robert Richardson's Upper East Side mansion cast fractured rainbows across marble floors that cost more than most people's homes. At 42, Robert stood 6 feet tall in his custom Armani tuxedo, surveying his domain with the cold satisfaction of a man who owned everything he could see, and most of what he couldn't. "Emma needs her medication at 8:30, Sarah Martinez said quietly, approaching from the grand staircase. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to speak without disturbing the air around wealthy men. Robert didn't turn around. "I didn't ask for a schedule update from the help." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After 5 years of caring for his daughter, she had become a master at swallowing responses that would cost her job. "Of course, Mr. Richardson. I just wanted to ensure—" "What you want is irrelevant." Robert's reflection in the massive window showed a man whose wealth had carved coldness into his features. "Tonight, 200 of America's most influential people will be in my home. Your job is to remain invisible." From the top of the staircase, 8-year-old Emma Richardson watched the exchange with eyes far too knowing for her age. She clutched a book about Renaissance painters that Sarah had given her, something her father would never think to provide. "Will Daddy talk to the important people about art like you do?" Emma whispered when Sarah climbed the stairs. Sarah knelt to Emma's level, smoothing the child's dark hair. "Your father has many important things to discuss tonight, but not about Michelangelo." The innocence in that question pierced Sarah's chest. "Maybe someday, sweetheart." Down in his study, Robert reviewed the guest list with predatory satisfaction. Magdalena Harrison, oil money. Dr. Albert Mendenhall, art collector worth 9 figures. Isabella Montgomery, petroleum heiress. Charles Morrison, tech sector entrepreneur. Patricia Salinas, social psychologist whose books influenced policy. Each name represented power, influence, and the kind of connections that transformed millions into billions. His phone buzzed. "Mr. Richardson, the catering staff has arrived," his assistant announced. "Good. And remind that nanny, whatever her name is, that she's to keep my daughter upstairs during the entire event. Sarah Martinez, sir. And yes, I'll inform her." Robert ended the call without acknowledgement. Names of staff were irrelevant details, like knowing the model numbers of his appliances. Outside, Manhattan glittered with the relentless ambition that had built his empire. Property values, market fluctuations, acquisition targets, these were the rhythms that governed his existence. Human emotions were inefficiencies he had systematically eliminated from his life. Upstairs, Sarah helped Emma into her pajamas while the little girl chatted about the Renaissance paintings they had studied together. "Did you know Michelangelo painted lying on his back for 4 years? Sarah told me his neck hurt terribly, but he kept painting because it was beautiful." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. A child understood more about sacrifice and dedication than the man who owned 17 buildings in Manhattan. "Sometimes the most beautiful things require the greatest dedication," Sarah said, tucking Emma into bed. "Is that why you stay here and take care of me? Even when Daddy is mean?" Sarah's breath caught. "What makes you think your father is mean?" "I have eyes," Emma said with devastating simplicity, "and ears. He talks to you like you're not real." As Sarah descended the main staircase, she passed mirrors that reflected back a woman in a simple black dress, unremarkable, designed to blend into expensive wallpaper. But behind her dark eyes lay depths that Robert Richardson had never bothered to explore. The first guests would arrive within the hour, and with them, a collision that would shatter the carefully constructed walls of Manhattan's most arrogant mansion. The golden cage was about to crack open. The Richardson mansion transformed into a cathedral of wealth as America's elite ascended the marble steps. Magdalena Harrison arrived in a gown that cost more than most annual salaries, her diamonds catching the light like captured stars. Dr. Albert Mendenhall followed, his eyes already cataloguing the artwork that adorned Robert's walls with the intensity of a man who had built his reputation on recognizing authentic genius. "Robert, magnificent as always," Magdalena purred, air-kissing his cheeks. Though I must say your Monet in the foyer. Is that from the Water Lilies series? Robert's smile was razor-sharp. Indeed. Acquired it last month from a private collector in Switzerland. Cost more than most people's houses. What he didn't mention was that he had no idea which series it belonged to or why it mattered. Art was currency to him, something to own, not understand. Doctor, Mendenhall approached the painting with scholarly reverence. Remarkable. The brushwork suggests this is from his later period, when his vision was beginning to fail. You can see how he compensated with larger, more expressive strokes. Fascinating, Robert replied, though his eyes had already moved to more arriving guests. Isabella Montgomery swept through the entrance with the confidence of generational petroleum wealth, followed by Charles Morrison, whose latest tech acquisition had made headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Patricia Salinas entered with quiet dignity, her keen psychologist's eyes already analyzing the social dynamics unfolding around her. Upstairs, Sarah read to Emma from their art book, their voices mixing with the sound of classical music and sophisticated conversation drifting from below. "Why can't I meet the people downstairs?" Emma asked, tracing her finger over a reproduction of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. "Your father thinks it's best if you rest. But I know about art too, you taught me. Don't you think they'd want to hear about Michelangelo's techniques?" Sarah's heart ached. This brilliant child possessed more genuine curiosity about art than most of the collectors downstairs, yet she was hidden away like an inconvenience. In the main ballroom, Robert orchestrated conversations like a conductor leading an orchestra of ambition. "The market downturn actually presents opportunities for those with vision," he declared to a circle of nodding billionaires. "I've acquired 3 prime properties in the past month alone." "Vision indeed," Charles Morrison agreed. "Though I find the real art is in knowing when to sell." "Speaking of art," Dr. Mendenhall interjected, "your collection has some interesting pieces, Robert. The Degas in your dining room, I'd love to discuss its provenance sometime." Robert's confidence flickered for a microsecond. Provenance was another word he collected but didn't truly understand. "Of course, though I find the business applications of aesthetics more compelling than academic discussions." "Doctor." Mendenhall's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, Sarah moved quietly through the mansion's upper floors, checking on Emma before beginning her evening duties. As she passed the servants' staircase, she encountered David Garcia, the mansion's head groundskeeper, carrying fresh flowers for the arrangements. "How's our little art historian tonight?" David asked in Spanish. "Learning about dedication and sacrifice," Sarah replied, also in Spanish. "Some lessons are more relevant than others in this house." David's weathered face cracked into a knowing smile. "The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife, isn't it?" Below them, the party reached its crescendo. Robert moved through his guests like a shark through familiar waters, each conversation calculated to advance his position in New York's ruthless social hierarchy. "The key," he announced to a rapt audience, "is understanding that some people are simply born to lead, while others are meant to serve. It's not cruelty. It's natural order." Patricia Salinas, the social psychologist, studied Robert with clinical interest. His words revealed more about his insecurities than his strengths, but she kept her observations to herself. "And your household staff?" Magdalena Harrison asked. "I assume you've found good help." "Adequate," Robert replied dismissively, "though you have to remember that when you're dealing with that class of people, expectations must remain realistic." The conversation paused as a server, Maria Rodriguez, elegantly refilled wine glasses with practiced precision. Her movements carried a grace that spoke of education rather than mere training, but none of the guests looked closely enough to notice. "The challenge," Robert continued, "is preventing staff from overstepping their boundaries. Sometimes they forget their place and need reminding." Dr. Mendenhall's expression grew thoughtful. As someone who had built his career on recognizing hidden value in artistic works, he had developed an eye for authenticity that extended beyond paintings. Upstairs, Emma had grown restless. "Sarah, can we go downstairs? Just for a minute? I want to show someone my drawing of the Sistine Chapel." "Sweetheart, your father was very clear. Please, I promise I'll be good. I just want to show them that I know about art too." Sarah looked into those bright, eager eyes and felt her resolve weakening. This brilliant child deserved to be seen, to be valued for her mind rather than hidden away like an embarrassment. Just for a moment, she whispered. But we stay near the stairs. As they descended toward the gathering storm below, neither Sarah nor Emma could have predicted that this simple decision would shatter the foundations of Robert Richardson's carefully constructed world. The moment of collision was approaching with the inevitability of a Manhattan sunset. Emma Richardson appeared at the top of the main staircase like a small angel in white pajamas, her drawing clutched in tiny hands. The magnificent ballroom spread below her, filled with elegant figures who moved through Robert's wealth like living jewelry. "Sarah, look how beautiful they all are," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was dangerous territory. Robert's fury when he discovered his daughter among his guests would be nuclear, but something in Emma's innocent excitement made it impossible to turn back. "Remember what we discussed about speaking only when spoken to," Sarah murmured, taking Emma's hand. They descended the grand staircase, Emma's bare feet silent on the marble steps. The classical music seemed to announce their arrival, though most guests remained absorbed in their own conversations about market fluctuations and political maneuvering. Dr. Albert Mendenhall was the first to notice them. His scholarly instincts, finely tuned after decades of identifying overlooked masterpieces, detected something unusual about the approaching pair. The woman moved with a confidence that contradicted her servant's attire, while the child radiated an intelligence that seemed almost luminous. "Well, hello there," Dr. Mendenhall said gently, crouching to Emma's level. "And who might you be, young lady?" "I'm Emma Richardson," she announced with perfect manners. "This is Sarah. She teaches me about art." Sarah felt the color drain from her face as conversations around them began to pause. Robert's daughter was now the center of attention, exactly what he had forbidden. "Art, you say?" Dr. Mendenhall's eyes sparkled with genuine interest. "And what have you been learning?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "We studied Michelangelo last week. Did you know he painted the Sistine Chapel lying on his back? His neck hurt terribly, but he kept painting because he wanted to make something beautiful for God." Several guests had turned to listen now, charmed by the child's earnest enthusiasm. Patricia Salinas, the social psychologist, watched with professional fascination as this 8-year-old displayed more genuine passion for art than most adults she knew. "That's absolutely right," Dr. Mendenhall said, his voice warm with approval. "Most people don't know about his physical suffering during that project. Where did you learn such details?" "Sarah taught me," Emma said proudly, holding up her drawing. "She knows everything about Renaissance painters. She says Michelangelo was painting stories from the Bible, but he made them look like real people with real feelings." Dr. Mendenhall examined Emma's drawing with the same careful attention he gave million-dollar paintings. The child had captured not just the basic composition of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but some essential understanding of its emotional depth. "This is quite remarkable," he said, looking up at Sarah with new interest. "You have an excellent teacher, Emma." Sarah felt trapped in a spotlight that was growing brighter by the moment. More guests were gathering, drawn by the unusual sight of a child discussing Renaissance art with sophisticated understanding. "Tell them about the David statue," Emma urged, tugging on Sarah's dress. "Tell them what you told me about how Michelangelo could see the man inside the marble." "Emma, perhaps we should," Sarah began, her voice tight with anxiety. "Please." Emma's eyes were bright with pride in her teacher. "You explain it so much better than my books." Charles Morrison, the tech entrepreneur, leaned in closer. "I'd like to hear this too. Renaissance art isn't typically a subject you encounter at children's bedtime." Sarah found herself surrounded by some of America's most influential people, all waiting for her response. The servant's mask she had worn for 5 years felt suddenly suffocating. "Michelangelo believed that every block of marble already contained the sculpture," she said quietly. "His job wasn't to create, but to reveal what was hidden inside." "Fascinating perspective," Dr. Mendenhall murmured. "That's a rather sophisticated interpretation of Renaissance Neoplatonic philosophy." "Sarah knows 6 languages too," Emma announced proudly, "and she reads poetry to me in Italian. It sounds like music." The circle of listeners grew larger. Isabella Montgomery, whose petroleum fortune funded several museums, studied Sarah with new attention. Something about this woman's bearing and vocabulary didn't match her position as household staff. 6 languages?" Patricia Salinas asked. That's quite remarkable. May I ask where you studied? Sarah felt the walls closing in. Each question pulled her deeper into dangerous territory, where her carefully maintained invisibility would shatter completely. From across the room, Robert Richardson noticed the gathering crowd around the main staircase. His business conversation with Magdalena Harrison about property investments suddenly seemed less important than the disruption occurring in his perfectly orchestrated evening. "What exactly is happening over there?" he asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose control was being challenged. Magdalena followed his gaze. "It appears your daughter has joined the party. How delightful. Children can add such charm to these events." Robert's jaw tightened. "My daughter should be in bed. And my staff should know better than to parade her around my guests like some kind of entertainment." He began moving through the crowd with predatory purpose, his expensive shoes clicking against marble with increasing urgency. The sound carried like a countdown to explosion. At the center of the growing circle, Emma continued her innocent revelations, each word pushing Sarah closer to the edge of a cliff she had spent 5 years avoiding. "Sarah says that art is about seeing the truth in beautiful things," Emma announced to her captivated audience. "She says that's why Michelangelo's people look so real, because he understood how to show what's inside them." Dr. Mendenhall exchanged a meaningful glance with Patricia Salinas. This child's education was extraordinary, and her teacher clearly possessed knowledge that went far beyond typical domestic training. The collision was seconds away now, and Sarah could feel it approaching like thunder before lightning, inevitable, devastating, and about to change everything forever. Robert Richardson cut through his own party like a blade through silk, his face a mask of controlled fury. The conversations around him seemed to slow and blur as his singular focus locked onto the cluster of guests surrounding his daughter and the woman who had betrayed his explicit instructions. "Emma!" His voice carried across the marble floor with the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "You should be in bed." The circle of guests parted unconsciously, sensing the tension that had suddenly electrified the air. Emma's face fell as she saw her father's expression, but she clutched her drawing closer to her chest. "Daddy, I was just showing everyone my picture of the Sistine Chapel." Dr. Mendenhall said it was remarkable. I'm sure he did. Robert's eyes fixed on Sarah with laser intensity. "I believe I made my expectations clear regarding my daughter's presence this evening." Sarah felt every eye in the room upon her. The careful neutrality she had maintained for 5 years crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. "Mr. Richardson." Emma was excited about her art lesson and... "Art lesson?" Robert's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "I think there's been some confusion about your qualifications and your role in this household." Dr. Mendenhall stepped forward, his academic instincts bristling at the dismissive tone. "Actually, Robert, your daughter has been giving us quite an impressive discussion of Renaissance techniques. Her understanding of Michelangelo's Neoplatonic influences is rather sophisticated." "Her understanding?" Robert's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from across the ballroom. "Dr. Mendenhall, I appreciate your politeness, but let's not pretend that my domestic staff is qualified to teach anything beyond basic childcare." The words hung in the air like a physical slap. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as the assembled guests shifted uncomfortably. Emma looked between her father and her beloved teacher, with confusion and growing distress. "Sarah knows more about art than anyone," Emma said, her voice small but defiant. "She taught me about perspective and symbolism, and, Emma, that's enough." Robert's attention turned fully to Sarah now, his public humiliation gathering momentum. "I think it's important that our guests understand exactly what we're dealing with here." Magdalena Harrison touched Robert's arm gently. "Perhaps this could be discussed privately." "No, I think it's educational for everyone." Robert's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. "You see, sometimes domestic workers forget their place and begin to believe they're qualified for roles that require actual education and expertise." Patricia Salinas, the social psychologist, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. Robert's behavior revealed deep insecurities, masked by displays of power, a classic pattern she had documented in her research. "The reality," Robert continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom, "is that some people are born to lead, innovate, and create, while others are meant to serve. It's not cruel. It's simply the natural order. He turned to address Sarah directly, his words calculated for maximum impact. So I think it's best if you remember that your job is to care for my daughter, not to pretend you're qualified to educate her about subjects that require genuine expertise. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she watched her father destroy the teacher she loved. The assembled guests, titans of industry, inheritors of generational wealth, leaders of American society, stood frozen in uncomfortable witness to this casual cruelty. Sarah Martinez felt something break open inside her chest. 5 years of swallowed words, 5 years of careful invisibility, 5 years of watching this brilliant child hunger for intellectual stimulation that her father couldn't provide. All of it crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "There are people born to lead and innovate and create." She took a step forward, her posture straightening as years of enforced submission fell away like discarded clothes. "But you've made a fundamental error in assuming you understand which category each person belongs to." The room held its breath. Robert's confidence flickered as something in Sarah's bearing shifted, the servant's mask slipping to reveal something unexpected underneath. "I have a confession to make to your guests," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My full name is Dr. Sarah Martinez Williams. I hold a Ph.D. in Renaissance art history from Columbia University, with specialized certifications in authentication techniques. I speak 6 languages fluently. I've published 14 papers in international academic journals, and until 5 years ago, I was the principal curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art." The silence stretched like a held breath. Dr. Mendenhall's eyes widened with recognition. He knew that name, knew her reputation in academic circles. "For 12 years, I authenticated paintings for Sotheby's and Christie's. I've advised governments on cultural preservation and helped recover stolen artworks worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Emma looked up at her teacher with wonder and confusion, not fully understanding the words, but sensing their explosive power. "So when your daughter asks me about Michelangelo's Neoplatonic influences, or the controversy surrounding the attribution of Salvator Mundi, or the restoration techniques used on the Sistine Chapel, I'm not pretending to know these things." Sarah's eyes met Robert's with unflinching directness. "I do know them. Better than most people in this room." The transformation was complete now. The invisible servant had become a force of nature, and the carefully ordered hierarchy of Robert Richardson's world was cracking apart like ice in spring. The collision had finally arrived, and its impact would shatter everything. The ballroom remained frozen in perfect silence, as if someone had pressed pause on a film featuring Manhattan's most powerful elite. Dr. Albert Mendenhall was the first to recover from the shock, his face transforming with dawning recognition. "Dr. Martinez Williams," he breathed, his voice filled with academic reverence. "The Salvator Mundi authentication that overturned the Christie's attribution, that was your work." Sarah nodded once curtly. The brushwork analysis revealed inconsistencies in the underpainting that suggested workshop origin rather than Leonardo's direct hand. "Though I understand the auction house wasn't pleased with my findings, of course Dr. Mendenhall's excitement was palpable, and your paper on the Sistine Chapel cleaning controversy, you were the one who proved that Michelangelo actually intended those brighter colors. The Vatican restoration team consulted your research." Robert Richardson stood paralyzed, his world tilting on its axis as the woman he had dismissed as help revealed credentials that outshone most of his guests. Emma clutched her drawing tighter, sensing the monumental shift occurring around her. "I don't understand," Robert managed, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "If you're what you claim to be, what are you doing here?" Sarah's smile was sharp as winter light. "What I claim to be? Dr. Mendenhall, perhaps you could help Mr. Richardson understand my qualifications." Dr. Mendenhall nodded eagerly. "Dr. Martinez Williams is considered one of the foremost experts on Renaissance authentication techniques in the world. Her work has been cited in over 300 academic papers. The Uffizi Museum in Florence consulted her research for their recent Caravaggio exhibition." "But how?" Magdalena Harrison began, then stopped, her social training warring with her curiosity. How does someone with my credentials end up cleaning your floors and changing your daughter's sheets? Sarah's voice carried 5 years of accumulated bitterness. Because sometimes, Mr. Richardson, people with actual genius are forced to take whatever work they can find. She turned to address the room, her presence now commanding the attention that wealth had previously demanded. My husband died in a car accident 6 years ago, leaving me with massive medical debts and no life insurance. My visa status was tied to my museum position, which I lost when the Met downsized their authentication department. I had exactly 3 choices: return to Mexico, marry for citizenship, or find work that would sponsor my visa. The assembled billionaires shifted uncomfortably, confronted with a reality that their wealth had insulated them from understanding. Your employment agency promised visa sponsorship for a 5-year contract, Sarah continued, her eyes boring into Robert's. What they didn't mention was that I would be treated as invisible furniture by a man who collects art he doesn't understand and displays wealth he didn't earn. Robert's face flushed deep red. I built my empire through inheriting your father's real estate portfolio and hiring people smarter than yourself to manage it. Sarah cut him off. Yes, I've seen your business model. It's not particularly complex. Charles Morrison, the tech entrepreneur, leaned forward with fascination. Dr. Martinez-Williams, your work on digital art authentication, didn't you develop the algorithm that can detect digital forgeries? The Morrison-Martinez method, yes, though I see you're familiar with my professional reputation, even if your host isn't. Patricia Salinas, studying the dynamics with professional interest, stepped forward. This is quite remarkable. Dr. Martinez-Williams, I've read your paper on social hierarchies in Renaissance art. Your analysis of how Michelangelo subverted class expectations in the Sistine Chapel was brilliant. Thank you. Though I must say, experiencing modern class warfare firsthand has given me new perspectives on historical power structures. Emma tugged on Sarah's dress, her young mind struggling to process the transformation of her beloved teacher into this commanding figure. Sarah, are you really famous? Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, her voice softening. I'm known in my field, sweetheart, but more importantly, I'm the same person who taught you about Michelangelo's dedication to beauty. That hasn't changed. But why didn't you tell Daddy you were smart? The innocence of that question hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah's eyes met Robert's over his daughter's head. Because your daddy never asked. And because smart women who don't know their place make some men very uncomfortable. Isabella Montgomery found her voice. Dr. Martinez-Williams, surely there were other options, universities, research positions? Have you tried finding academic work in America without citizenship or connections? My Mexican PhD required additional American certifications. I needed 3 years of documented employment for permanent residency status. Mr. Richardson's household provided both a visa sponsor and the time to complete my certification requirements. But that means, Dr. Mendenhall began. That means, Sarah said, standing to face Robert directly, I've spent 5 years changing the sheets and emptying the trash of a man who owns 3 paintings I authenticated, while he lectured me about knowing my place. The earthquake had shattered every assumption in the room, but Sarah Martinez-Williams wasn't finished yet. In fact, Mr. Richardson, that Monet in your foyer that you were so proud of earlier, the one you told Mrs. Harrison cost more than most people's houses, I have some interesting news about its provenance that I think your insurance company would find fascinating. Robert's face went white. The revelation earthquake was about to trigger an avalanche. The color drained from Robert Richardson's face as Sarah's words about his Monet hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. But she wasn't finished. The earthquake had only begun. Before we discuss your art collection, Mr. Richardson, I think your guest should meet the rest of your extraordinary staff. Sarah moved toward the service entrance with the confidence of someone finally free to speak truth. David, Maria, Carlos, could you join us for a moment? 3 figures emerged from the kitchen area. David Garcia, the soft-spoken groundskeeper, Maria Rodriguez, the elegant cook, and Carlos Fernandez, the quiet maintenance man. They approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented attention. Don't worry, Sarah said gently in Spanish. It's time. Dr. Mendenhall watched with growing fascination as Sarah conducted what appeared to be a revelation symphony. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce some of the most underutilized talent in Manhattan. Sarah's voice carried the authority of a curator unveiling a major exhibition. "David Garcia, who maintains your beautiful gardens, Mr. Richardson." David stepped forward awkwardly, his weathered hands showing decades of soil and sun. David was the director of the National Sustainable Agriculture Program at UC Davis for 15 years. He developed irrigation systems that increased agricultural productivity by 300% across 7 states. His research on drought-resistant crops is currently being implemented in over 30 countries. The billionaires stared at the man they had passed countless times without notice. Charles Morrison's jaw dropped. He had read about revolutionary agricultural techniques in tech journals without realizing he was looking at their creator. "Maria Rodriguez," Sarah continued, "your excellent chef tonight." Maria curtsied slightly, her grace suggesting education rather than just service training. Maria was a professor of literature at UCLA for 20 years, specializing in Gabriel Garcia Marquez and contemporary Latin American narrative. She has published 2 books of literary criticism and was working on her 3rd when budget cuts eliminated her position. Patricia Salinas gasped audibly. "Professor Rodriguez? I cited your work on magical realism in my own research. Your analysis of social psychology in 100 Years of Solitude was groundbreaking." Maria's face lit up with unexpected joy. "You read my work?" "Extensively. Your theories about collective memory and individual identity influenced an entire generation of scholars." Sarah smiled, watching connections form between people who had been invisible to each other. "And finally, Carlos Fernandez, who keeps your mechanical systems running so efficiently." Carlos stepped forward with quiet dignity, his intelligent eyes scanning the room full of America's elite. Carlos was a professor of physics at MIT for 30 years, specializing in quantum optics. He developed the laser correction systems now used in over 90% of eye surgeries worldwide. His research on photon manipulation has applications in quantum computing that are still being explored today. The silence was thunderous. Dr. Mendenhall looked like he was having a religious experience. "Professor Fernandez, the Fernandez-Chen equations for laser focusing. That's your work?" Carlos nodded modestly. "Though the medical applications were developed later by other teams." "Other teams building on your foundational research," Charles Morrison interjected, his tech background making him appreciate the significance. "Your work is cited in dozens of patents I've seen." Robert Richardson stood amid his shattered assumptions, like a man watching his house burn down. "This is impossible. You clean floors, you garden. We're what we needed to be to survive," Sarah said firmly. "But we never stopped being who we are." Emma looked around at the adults with growing excitement. "So everyone who takes care of me is famous?" "In their fields, yes," Sarah replied. "David's agricultural research feeds millions of people. Maria's books are taught in universities around the world. Carlos's inventions help people see clearly. And your art lessons come from someone who has authenticated paintings worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Isabella Montgomery found her voice. "But how is this possible? How did you all end up here?" David stepped forward, his voice steady. "Climate change research funding was cut. My department was eliminated. At 58, I couldn't find another academic position. Mr. Richardson's agency offered visa sponsorship and steady work." Maria nodded. "University budget cuts eliminated tenure positions. I couldn't afford to return to Columbia empty-handed. My family depends on the money I send home." Carlos's voice was quiet but clear. "Age discrimination in academia is real. After 60, finding research positions becomes nearly impossible. This work allowed me to keep my visa status while supporting my grandchildren's education." Patricia Salinas was taking mental notes, her social psychology background making her appreciate the systemic forces that had created this situation. "You're documenting this, aren't you, Dr. Martinez-Williams?" Sarah's smile was sharp. "I'm writing a book, Invisible Genius, The Hidden PhDs Cleaning Our Houses. It's about America's waste of immigrant talent and the cost of our arbitrary class hierarchies." Robert finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "Why didn't any of you tell me?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications. Carlos answered with devastating simplicity. "When did you ever ask?" The Hidden Genius Network had been revealed, But the biggest revelation was still coming. The mansion's ballroom had become a courtroom where privilege itself was on trial. Robert Richardson stood before his guests, and more importantly, before the mirror of his own actions, as the weight of 5 years' willful blindness crashed down upon him. "You want to know why we didn't tell you?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "Let me share some memories, Mr. Richardson." She turned to address the room, transforming from servant to prosecutor. 3 years ago, David tried to mention that your garden's irrigation system was wasteful during a water shortage. You told him to stick to pulling weeds and leave thinking to people qualified for it. David nodded sadly. "I had designed sustainable systems for entire states, but I couldn't even suggest a simple sprinkler adjustment. 2 years ago," Sarah continued, "Maria attempted to discuss the nutritional balance of Emma's meals, considering her growing mind needed specific nutrients. You informed her that the help doesn't provide medical advice." Maria's voice was soft but clear. "I had researched childhood nutrition for my literature classes, studying how malnutrition affects learning in Latin American communities. But my PhD in literature apparently didn't qualify me to suggest vegetables. And Carlos," Sarah's eyes found the elderly physicist, "when your heating system was failing last winter, you specifically told him not to waste your time with technical explanations and to just fix it quietly." Carlos spread his hands. "I could have explained how to upgrade your entire system for better efficiency and lower costs, but you wanted silence, not solutions." The assembled billionaires shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own attitudes reflected in Robert's behavior. Patricia Salinas was frantically taking mental notes. This was a real-time case study in how social hierarchy destroyed human potential. Emma tugged on her father's tuxedo jacket. "Daddy, why didn't you want to hear their ideas?" The innocence of that question hit Robert like a physical blow. He knelt down to his daughter's level, his voice cracking. I thought I knew better than they did." "But they're really smart," Emma said with 8-year-old logic. "Smarter than you, right? About their special things?" The truth of that statement hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Dr. Mendenhall stepped forward, his academic mind reeling. "Robert, do you understand what you've had under your roof? Dr. Martinez-Williams could authenticate any piece in your collection. Professor Fernandez could revolutionize your building's energy efficiency. Professor Rodriguez could provide insights into cultural dynamics that could transform your international business dealings. And David could design sustainable systems that would save you thousands while helping the environment." Robert stood slowly, his face a map of dawning comprehension. "I have the most expensive art consultants in New York. I pay engineering firms millions for building efficiency studies. I hire cultural consultants for international deals. While the expertise you needed lived in your basement," Charles Morrison observed. "It's like having Einstein as your janitor and hiring someone else to explain relativity." Isabella Montgomery's petroleum heiress background made her understand waste when she saw it. "Robert, the opportunity cost alone. If you had recognized their value 5 years ago, we could have revolutionized everything," Sarah finished. "Your business, your daughter's education, your understanding of the world around you." Emma looked around at all the adults, then back at her father. "Are you sad, Daddy?" Robert felt tears he hadn't shed in decades threatening to spill. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm very sad and very sorry." "Sorry for what?" "How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you've wasted years of genius because your arrogance was stronger than your curiosity? How do you admit that pride had blinded you to the extraordinary people who shared your home? I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I didn't ask questions. I'm sorry I treated wonderful people badly." Patricia Salinas watched this moment with professional fascination. She was witnessing a psychological breakthrough in real time, the moment when destructive patterns of thinking finally cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence. Magdalena Harrison, who had built her own fortune through recognizing valuable investments, stepped forward. "Robert, the question now is what you do with this knowledge." Sarah looked around the room at the assembled titans of American industry and power. "Actually, that brings me to the most important point of this evening." She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention with the natural authority of someone accustomed to lecturing in halls of higher learning. "We're not unique. Across Manhattan, across America, there are thousands of highly educated immigrants working as janitors, nannies, taxi drivers, and restaurant workers. People with medical degrees driving Uber, engineers cleaning offices, scientists delivering food. The weight of her words settled over the room like snow. The question isn't just what Mr. Richardson does with his newfound awareness. The question is what all of you do with yours. The mirror of truth was reflecting back at every person in the room, and none of them liked what they saw. But truth, once revealed, demands action, and the night was far from over. Robert Richardson stared at the marble floor of his ballroom, his reflection distorted in its polished surface like a funhouse mirror of his own moral failures. The assembled elite of New York society watched him with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, each recognizing aspects of their own behavior in his public reckoning. "I need to sit down," Robert said quietly. His commanding presence deflated like a punctured balloon. Emma immediately moved to her father's side, her small hand finding his larger one. "It's okay, Daddy. Sarah says everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." The wisdom from his 8-year-old daughter, wisdom she had learned from the woman he had spent 5 years dismissing, cut deeper than any accusation. Dr. Mendenhall approached carefully, his academic instincts recognizing a moment of profound transformation. "Robert, I've seen this before in art authentication. Sometimes we become so convinced of our initial assessment that we can't see what's right in front of us. The difference," Sarah said firmly, "is that in art authentication, the only thing at stake is money. Here, we're talking about human dignity and wasted potential." Charles Morrison, his tech entrepreneur mind already racing ahead to solutions, stepped forward. "Dr. Martinez-Williams, you mentioned other qualified immigrants in similar situations. How widespread is this?" Sarah's eyes lit up with the passion of someone finally able to discuss her research. "My preliminary studies suggest there are over 50,000 people with advanced degrees working in positions far below their qualifications in the New York metropolitan area alone." 50,000? Isabella Montgomery's voice betrayed her shock. Doctors working as hospital orderlies while studying for American medical licensing exams. Engineers driving taxicabs while completing certification requirements. Teachers cleaning buildings while learning to navigate our educational bureaucracy. Carlos stepped forward, his quiet voice carrying decades of accumulated observation. "We know each other. The physicist washing dishes at the restaurant where the former surgeon works as a busboy, the mathematician cleaning the law firm where the former judge works as a translator." Maria nodded. "There's an entire hidden economy of genius, invisible to the people who could benefit most from our knowledge." Patricia Salinas was furiously scribbling notes in her mind, her social psychology background making her appreciate the systemic nature of what she was witnessing. "This is a massive market failure. The inefficiency alone—" "It's more than inefficiency," David said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen agricultural systems fail due to ignored expertise. "It's human tragedy on an industrial scale." Robert finally raised his head, his eyes finding Sarah's. "How many years have I wasted? How much could Emma have learned? How much could my businesses have improved?" "That's not the right question," Emma said with startling clarity. "The right question is, what are you going to do now?" Out of the mouths of babes came the wisdom that had eluded her father for years. Magdalena Harrison, whose oil fortune had taught her to recognize valuable resources, stepped forward. "Sarah, Dr. Martinez-Williams, what would it take to address this systematically?" "First, recognition that the problem exists. Tonight is the first time I've seen a room full of influential Americans actually understand the scope of wasted talent in their own city." "And then?" Charles Morrison asked, his tech background making him think in terms of scalable solutions. "Then investment in systems that identify, evaluate, and place qualified immigrants in positions that match their abilities rather than just their visa status." Dr. Mendenhall's excitement was building. A talent authentication system, essentially, like art provenance but for human potential. Exactly. And programs that help people navigate certification requirements while contributing their knowledge to society. Robert looked around his ballroom, at the guests he had invited to display his wealth, at the staff he had ignored despite their extraordinary qualifications, at his daughter who had learned more from his employees than from him. "I want to fund this," he said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "Whatever it takes. I want to create the program you're describing." Sarah studied his face carefully. "This isn't about assuaging your guilt, Mr. Richardson. This is about systematic change that goes far beyond your personal redemption. I understand that. Robert's voice was steadier now, as if making this commitment was restoring some essential part of himself. But I have resources, connections, and now I have understanding. If I don't use them to fix this, then I've learned nothing. Emma squeezed her father's hand. That's good, Daddy. Sarah always says that learning without action isn't really learning at all. The gathering had transformed from a charity gala designed to display wealth into something unprecedented. A meeting of minds dedicated to addressing a problem none of them had recognized hours earlier. But the most dramatic transformation was yet to come. The ballroom had evolved into something resembling a think tank, with America's most powerful individuals clustering around David, Maria, Carlos, and Sarah, asking questions about everything from agricultural innovation to quantum optics. The carefully maintained social hierarchy that had governed the evening had completely collapsed, replaced by something more authentic, actual intellectual curiosity. Robert Richardson stood at the center of it all, watching his world reorganize itself around principles he was only beginning to understand. Emma sat nearby, her art book open as she showed Dr. Mendenhall her drawing while explaining what Sarah had taught her about perspective. Mr. Richardson, Patricia Salinas approached with the focused intensity of someone whose research had suddenly become dramatically relevant. If you're serious about addressing this issue systematically, you'll need more than good intentions. What do you mean? Creating effective change requires understanding the psychological and social barriers that prevent recognition of hidden talent. My research on cognitive bias suggests that people like, she gestured around the room, like all of us are programmed to dismiss competence that doesn't match our preconceptions. Charles Morrison overheard and joined the conversation. It's like pattern recognition in technology. Our algorithms are only as good as their training data. If we train ourselves to equate social position with competence, we'll miss talent that doesn't fit the pattern. Sarah watched this conversation with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had seen well-meaning commitments evaporate when confronted with the actual work required for change. The question, she interjected, is whether you're willing to commit to something more than just writing checks. Robert turned to face her fully. What kind of commitment are you talking about? Real engagement, learning, admitting that people you've dismissed might know things you need to learn. Are you prepared to become a student again? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about charity or noblesse oblige. This was about fundamental transformation. Emma looked up from her book. Daddy, will you study art with Sarah and me? The simple question carried profound implications. Was Robert Richardson willing to sit at the feet of a woman he had treated as invisible furniture and learn about subjects he had only collected, never understood? Yes, Robert said without hesitation. I want to learn everything I've missed. Dr. Mendenhall stepped forward, his academic enthusiasm overriding social conventions. Robert, if you're serious about this, let me suggest something. Why don't you commit to spending 1 hour each day for the next year learning from each member of your staff? 1 hour each day with each person, Robert calculated quickly. That's 4 hours a day. Less time than you spend on golf, Magdalena Harrison observed dryly. What would I learn? David answered. Sustainable systems thinking. How to see interconnections between resources, efficiency, and environmental impact. Maria's voice was warm. Literature as a window into human psychology and cultural understanding. How stories shape societies, and how understanding narrative can improve leadership. Carlos spoke quietly. Physics principles that apply to business optimization, energy efficiency, and understanding how complex systems actually work. Sarah's eyes met Robert's directly. Art as a language for understanding beauty, authenticity, and the difference between valuable and merely expensive. Emma clapped her hands together. It'll be like school, but better, because you'll have the smartest teachers in the world. The assembled guests watched this unprecedented moment unfold. Patricia Salinas realized she was witnessing something that could revolutionize how American society approached immigrant talent. If Robert commits to this learning process, she said thoughtfully, and documents the experience, it could become a model for other wealthy families. Isabella Montgomery nodded. The petroleum industry has wasted so much talent by assuming that only certain backgrounds produce expertise. If we could identify and utilize hidden talent, The economic implications alone would be staggering, Charles Morrison added. We're talking about unleashing human capital that's been systematically ignored. Robert looked around the room at the faces watching him, some skeptical, some hopeful, all waiting to see if his commitment would prove genuine. I want to make a public commitment, he announced, not just to learning from my staff, but to creating something bigger. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What kind of commitment? Robert's voice grew stronger as the vision crystallized. I want to establish the Richardson-Martinez Learning Center, dedicated to identifying and supporting qualified immigrants who are working below their potential. The Richardson-Martinez Center. Sarah's surprise was evident. Your name should be first, Robert said firmly. Your expertise, your vision, your book research, this is your project. I'm just providing the resources. Emma beamed. The Martinez-Richardson Center sounds better anyway. The adults laughed, but the child's instinct was correct. Sarah had earned the right to have her name lead. What exactly would this center do? Dr. Mendenhall asked. Sarah, feeling the possibility of her research becoming reality, stepped forward. Comprehensive talent assessment, skills verification, mentorship programs pairing qualified immigrants with industry leaders, scholarship funding for certification requirements, and job placement services that match people with positions worthy of their abilities. How many people could you help? Magdalena Harrison asked. With proper funding and connections, Sarah calculated quickly, we could impact thousands of lives within the first year. Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine excitement about helping others rather than accumulating for himself. Then, let's begin tonight. I commit to providing $2 million in initial funding and spending the next year learning from the extraordinary people I've been too blind to see. The commitment was made before witnesses who could hold him accountable, but the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead, when the spotlight of this dramatic evening faded and the hard work of transformation began. Emma raised her small hand. Can I help too? And with that question, 3 generations of the Richardson family began their journey toward becoming worthy of the genius that had been hidden in plain sight all along. 3 weeks after the gala that changed everything, the Richardson mansion had transformed into something unprecedented. A learning laboratory where America's wealthiest business owner sat at the feet of his former servants, notebook in hand, ego finally subdued by curiosity. The morning light streaming through the conservatory windows illuminated an extraordinary scene. Robert Richardson, dressed in simple khakis and a polo shirt, kneeling in the garden beside David Garcia, his hands covered in soil for the first time in decades. The root system tells you everything about the plant's health, David explained, gently excavating around a struggling rosebush. See how these roots are circling instead of expanding? That's what happens when growth is artificially constrained. Robert studied the tangled roots with new eyes. It's like my business model, isn't it? Growing in circles instead of expanding into new territories. David's weathered face cracked into a smile. Plants and businesses have more in common than most people realize. Both need proper foundation, adequate resources, and room to grow. Emma watched from her bedroom window as her father learned to see the world through different eyes. The sight of him listening, really listening, to someone he had previously dismissed, filled her 8-year-old heart with hope. Inside the mansion's kitchen, Robert's afternoons were spent with Maria Rodriguez, who had transformed the utilitarian space into a classroom for understanding culture through cuisine. Food is narrative, Maria explained as they prepared a traditional Colombian dish together. Every ingredient tells a story about geography, history, and human migration. When you understand the story, you understand the people. Robert fumbled with the knife technique Maria demonstrated. I've been eating food for 42 years without ever thinking about its stories. Most wealthy people consume culture without comprehending it, Maria said gently. You collect experiences like you collected art, for display rather than understanding. Ouch, Robert said, but he was smiling. Is that going to be a theme in these lessons? Truth often stings before it heals. In the evenings, Carlos Fernandez transformed the mansion study into a physics laboratory, using everyday objects to demonstrate principles that governed everything from Robert's real estate empire to his daughter's bicycle. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, Carlos explained, using a pendulum made from a crystal paperweight. It can only be transformed from one form to another. Robert watched the pendulum's hypnotic motion. Like wealth? Exactly. The question isn't how to accumulate energy or wealth, but how to transform it into something useful for society. I've been hoarding energy instead of transforming it. Carlos nodded. Potential energy becomes kinetic energy only when you allow it to move. But it was Sarah's art lessons that proved most transformative. 3 evenings each week, Robert and Emma sat together in the mansion's gallery, while Sarah revealed the hidden languages of painting and sculpture. "Look at this Monet again," Sarah said, standing before the water lilies painting that had adorned Robert's foyer like expensive wallpaper. "What do you see now that you understand Monet's cataracts were destroying his vision when he painted it?" Robert stared at the canvas with new intensity. He wasn't painting what he saw clearly. He was painting what he felt about light and beauty, even as his sight failed. "The physical limitation became artistic liberation," Sarah confirmed. "Sometimes our greatest constraints inspire our most authentic creations." Emma raised her small hand. "Is that why Daddy's old life had to break before he could become better?" The profound simplicity of that question stopped all 3 adults in their tracks. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes we have to lose what we think we want before we can find what we actually need." Robert felt tears threatening again, a sensation that had become less frightening over the past weeks. "Emma, how did you become so wise?" "I have really good teachers," she said matter-of-factly. "All of them." Meanwhile, across Manhattan, word of the Richardson transformation was spreading through exclusive circles. The man who had publicly humiliated his staff was now publicly learning from them, and the story had captured imaginations from Wall Street to the Upper East Side. Patricia Salinas had begun documenting the experiment for her research, visiting weekly to observe the psychological changes occurring in real time. "What you're experiencing," she told Robert during one of her visits, "is called intellectual humility. It's the recognition that expertise exists independently of social status." "It's harder than I expected," Robert admitted. "Not the learning, that's exciting, but the confronting how wrong I've been about everything." "Growth is uncomfortable," Patricia observed, "but you're modeling something revolutionary for your daughter." Emma, overhearing, looked up from her art supplies. "What's revolutionary?" "Your father is showing you that adults can change, learn, and admit when they're wrong. That's very rare in people with power." "But isn't that what smart people do?" Emma asked. "Yes," Patricia smiled, "but your father is learning to be smart in new ways." The lessons were transforming more than just Robert's understanding. They were creating a new model for how wealth and power could interact with knowledge and humility. But the real test was still coming. 6 months after the gala, the Richardson Martinez Learning Center occupied 3 floors of a converted Manhattan office building, its walls lined with success stories that read like fairy tales made real. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid, formerly a taxi driver with a medical degree from Damascus, now headed the cardiovascular research department at Mount Sinai Hospital. Sarah Chen, who had cleaned offices while studying pharmacology, had launched a startup developing accessible medications and already secured $2 million in venture capital funding. Robert Richardson walked through the center's halls with the wonder of someone discovering a new continent. In Conference Room A, Dr. Elena Volkov, a former hotel housekeeper with a PhD in environmental science, was presenting her research on urban air purification to a panel of city planning officials. In the workshop space, Miguel Santos, formerly a restaurant dishwasher, was training a group of engineers on the bridge design principles he had developed in his native Brazil. 127 people, Sarah reported as they reached her office, a space that combined the functionality of a career counseling center with the intellectual rigor of a university research facility. 127 qualified professionals have been successfully placed in positions that match their education and experience. Robert studied the wall of photographs showing before and after career transformations. And the economic impact? Conservative estimates suggest these placements have generated over $15 million in additional economic activity. The hidden talent we've uncovered is contributing at levels that surprise even me. Emma, now 9 years old and serving as the center's unofficial mascot, looked up from her homework at Sarah's desk. "Tell him about Dr. Patel." Sarah smiled. Dr. Aisha Patel was working as a night shift janitor while trying to navigate the medical licensing maze. She's now a pediatric oncologist at Columbia Presbyterian. Last month, she developed a new treatment protocol that's showing remarkable success rates. One person, Robert mused, one brilliant mind that was scrubbing floors while children needed her expertise. Multiply that by thousands across the country, Sarah said. The waste is staggering. The success had attracted attention far beyond Manhattan. Charles Morrison had committed $5 million to expand the program to Silicon Valley. Isabella Montgomery was funding a similar center in Houston. Dr. Mendenhall had convinced 3 museums to create authentication apprenticeships for qualified immigrants. But the most profound changes were happening within the Richardson family itself. Robert's transformation from arrogant billionaire to curious student had been documented by Patricia Salinas in a groundbreaking study on adult behavioral change. The man who once measured his worth in dollars now measured it in understanding gained and potential unlocked. "Daddy's different now," Emma confided to Sarah during one of their art lessons. "He asks questions instead of just talking, and he actually listens to the answers." "How does that make you feel?" "Proud," Emma said simply. "And sad that he waited so long to become himself." The wisdom in that observation, that Robert was becoming more himself rather than someone different, captured something essential about the transformation process. Meanwhile, the mansion itself had evolved into a living classroom. David's sustainable garden had become a model for urban agriculture, attracting delegations from environmental organizations. Maria's kitchen hosted cultural immersion dinners, where business leaders learned about international markets through food and storytelling. Carlos's physics demonstrations had inspired 3 young neighbors to pursue STEM careers. The weekly schedule that once revolved around accumulating wealth now centered on exchanging knowledge. Monday mornings with David in the garden, discussing systems thinking and environmental stewardship. Tuesday afternoons with Maria, exploring cultural intelligence through literature and cuisine. Wednesday evenings with Carlos, applying physics principles to business and life optimization. Thursday and Friday sessions with Sarah, developing aesthetic literacy and authentication skills. "I'm learning to see," Robert explained to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who was documenting the center's success. "For years, I collected beautiful things without understanding beauty. I hired smart people without recognizing intelligence. I accumulated power without grasping how to use it constructively. And now I understand that true wealth isn't what you own. It's what you know, who you learn from, and how many people you help discover their own potential." The article, titled "The Billionaire Who Went Back to School," sparked a national conversation about class, education, and the hidden costs of social hierarchy. Letters poured in from immigrants around the country, sharing their own stories of credentials ignored and potential wasted. But not everyone was pleased with Robert's transformation. "You've become a laughingstock," Magdalena Harrison told him during a tense lunch at their private club. "The man who takes orders from his former servants. People are talking, Robert." "Let them talk," Robert replied calmly. "I've learned more in the past 6 months than in the previous 6 years. You're teaching your daughter that hierarchy doesn't matter. That's dangerous thinking for someone in her position." Robert's eyes hardened, a flash of his old self defending his new values. "I'm teaching my daughter that competence and character matter more than inheritance and accident of birth. If that threatens your worldview, perhaps your worldview needs examination." The conversation ended poorly, with Magdalena storming out and Robert realizing that his transformation had cost him certain relationships while creating others far more meaningful. That evening, as Robert helped Emma with her math homework, a scene that would have been impossible a year earlier, she asked the question that had been building in his mind. "Daddy, do you think other rich people will want to learn like you did?" Robert considered this carefully. The center's success had proven that hidden talent existed everywhere, waiting for recognition and opportunity. But would other wealthy Americans be willing to undergo the humbling process of admitting their blindness? "Some will," he said finally. "And maybe that's enough to start changing everything." Emma nodded seriously. "Sarah says revolutions begin with one person deciding to see clearly." Outside the mansion windows, Manhattan glittered with its usual ambitious energy. But inside, a different kind of ambition was taking root, the desire to unlock human potential rather than merely accumulate material wealth. The ripple effect was spreading. But the biggest wave was yet to come. 1 year after the night that changed everything, the Richardson Martinez Learning Center had spawned branches in 7 cities: Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Seattle, Atlanta, and Miami. Each center operated under the same principle, identifying qualified immigrants working below their potential and creating pathways to positions that matched their expertise. The Manhattan headquarters buzzed with an energy that transcended typical non-profit work. In the main conference room, Sarah presided over a video call connecting all 8 locations, their screens showing a tapestry of faces representing the hidden genius they were uncovering across America. Boston reports 37 successful placements this quarter, announced Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a Harvard-trained psychologist who had left her private practice to run the Boston Center, including a former Syrian architect who's now leading the city's sustainable housing initiative. Los Angeles has placed 41 people, chimed in Maria Santos, no relation to the Miguel Santos from earlier, a former studio executive who had been inspired by Robert's transformation. Our entertainment industry connections have been crucial for placing qualified immigrants in creative fields. Robert watched from the back of the room, no longer needing to be the center of attention. His role had evolved from benefactor to student to advocate, using his wealth and connections to open doors that others could walk through. Emma, now a sophisticated 9-year-old with an art education that rivaled some college students, sat beside him, sketching the faces on the video screens. Her ability to capture not just likenesses, but essential character in her drawings had amazed even Sarah. The economic impact data is extraordinary, continued Patricia Salinas, who had taken a sabbatical from her university position to study the center's effectiveness. Conservative estimates suggest our network has generated over $200 million in additional economic activity through improved job matching. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the human stories that gave the work its meaning. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid, the former taxi driver turned cardiac researcher, had presented his findings on innovative treatment protocols to the American Medical Association. His work was saving lives at a rate impossible in his previous profession. Sarah Chen's pharmaceutical startup had successfully brought 3 new medications to market, focusing on conditions that primarily affected immigrant communities, often ignored by major drug companies. Miguel Santos, the former dishwasher, had been hired by the city of Chicago to redesign their bridge infrastructure, applying principles he had developed but never been able to implement. The success stories accumulated like snowflakes, each individual yet part of a larger pattern that was reshaping how America thought about talent and potential. "Robert," Sarah said, as the video call concluded, "we need to discuss the next phase." They moved to her office, Emma trailing behind with her sketchbook and an endless supply of questions. "The demand is overwhelming," Sarah continued. "We're receiving over 500 inquiries per week from qualified immigrants seeking help, and almost as many from employers who've realized they need access to this talent pool. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to go national, really national. Not just major cities, but smaller communities where hidden talent might be even more isolated." Robert leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the logistics and possibilities. "The funding requirements would be enormous. Which is why I've been talking to Charles Morrison about developing a technology platform, something that could scale identification and matching processes without requiring physical centers everywhere." Emma looked up from her drawing. "Like a computer program that helps smart people find the right jobs." "Exactly like that, sweetheart," Sarah smiled. "Your artistic mind captures complex ideas beautifully." The technology solution appealed to Robert's business instincts, but he had learned to think beyond efficiency metrics. What about the human element, the mentorship, the cultural navigation, the personal support? "Hybrid model," Sarah explained. "Technology for initial identification and matching, physical centers for intensive support in major metropolitan areas, and regional coordinators for ongoing mentorship in smaller communities." As they discussed implementation details, David Garcia knocked on the office door. His success with sustainable agriculture had led to consulting opportunities around the world, but he remained committed to the center that had recognized his potential. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to share something," David said, his face glowing with excitement. "I just received a call from the United Nations. They want to implement the agricultural systems I developed here in refugee settlements across 3 continents. The magnitude of that impact, knowledge developed in Robert's garden now feeding displaced people worldwide, embodied everything the center represented. "David, that's incredible," Robert said, standing to embrace the man whose expertise he had once dismissed as pulling weeds. "It started with you asking me about root systems," David replied. "Sometimes the smallest recognition leads to global change." Emma finished her drawing and showed it to the adults. She had captured David's face in the moment of sharing his UN news, somehow managing to convey both his dignity and his joy. "Emma, this is beautiful," Sarah said. "You've captured something essential about who David is." "I just draw what I see," Emma replied, "and I see that everyone here is important." That evening, as Robert tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question that had been percolating through the day's conversations. "Daddy, do you think America will become a place where everyone gets to use their smartness?" Robert considered this carefully. The centers were proof that change was possible, but systemic transformation required more than good intentions and funding. "I think we're building something that could make that happen," he said finally. "But it will take time and many people working together." "Like a really big art project?" "Exactly like a really big art project. One that takes many artists working together to create something beautiful." Emma nodded seriously. "Sarah says the best art makes the world better. What do you think our art project is making better?" "People," Emma said simply. "We're making people better by helping them be who they really are." As Robert turned off the lights, he reflected on his daughter's wisdom. The child who had once been hidden away during his status-obsessed parties was now the philosophical heart of a movement that was transforming American attitudes toward talent and potential. The network was expanding, but the most important expansion was happening in hearts and minds, one recognition at a time. 2 years after the gala that shattered his old world, Robert Richardson faced the ultimate test of his transformation. The boardroom of Richardson Enterprises, once his temple of wealth accumulation, now hosted a meeting that would determine whether his personal growth could survive the pressures of institutional change. Across the mahogany table sat the company's board of directors, old money conservatives, who had watched Robert's philanthropic phase with growing concern. Their leader, Harrison Whitfield III, great-grandson of a steel baron, had called this meeting with one purpose: to rein in what he considered Robert's dangerous deviation from profit-maximizing principles. "Robert, we need to discuss your recent decisions," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of generational wealth. "The board has concerns about the direction of your educational initiatives." Robert kept his voice calm, drawing on lessons learned from 2 years of intellectual humility. "Which concerns specifically? For starters, you've committed over $50 million to these centers without clear return on investment projections. That money could have been used for property acquisitions that would generate actual revenue." "The centers have generated over $400 million in economic activity," Robert replied. "The ROI is demonstrable." "Economic activity for others," interjected Margaret Thornton, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. "Your fiduciary responsibility is to shareholders, not to social experiments." Emma, now 10 years old and spending her school vacation observing her father's work, watched from the corner of the boardroom where she sat quietly with her art supplies. Sarah had taught her that observing power dynamics was as educational as studying Renaissance paintings. "I'd like the board to meet someone," Robert said, pressing his intercom. "Could you ask Dr. Martinez-Williams to join us?" Harrison's eyebrows rose. "The former nanny." "Robert, this is a board meeting, not a diversity presentation. Dr. Martinez-Williams is the co-founder and director of our most successful investment," Robert replied firmly. Sarah entered with the confidence of someone whose expertise had been validated by results rather than inheritance. She carried a tablet loaded with data that told the story of systemic change. "Gentlemen, Ms. Thornton," Sarah nodded to each board member, "I understand you have questions about the economic viability of recognizing hidden talent." "Dr. Martinez-Williams," Harrison's tone was patronizing, "we appreciate your enthusiasm, but business decisions require analysis beyond social sentiment." Sarah's smile was sharp as a scalpel. "You're absolutely right. Let me share some analysis." She activated the room's presentation system, displaying charts that made the board members lean forward despite their skepticism. In the past 24 months, our network has identified and placed 1,247 qualified immigrants in positions matching their expertise. The average salary increase for these individuals was 340%. The economic multiplier effect, increased tax revenue, consumer spending, business creation, has generated approximately $800 million in additional economic activity. Margaret Thornton shifted uncomfortably. But what's the return to Richardson Enterprises specifically? Excellent question. 12 companies in your investment portfolio have hired our candidates. Their performance metrics exceed traditional hires by an average of 40%. 3 startups founded by our participants have received venture capital funding totaling $47 million. Your fund's stake in those companies is already worth $12 million. Harrison frowned. Those are impressive numbers, but they don't justify the reputational risk. Robert's association with this program has made him a target for criticism from serious business leaders. Emma looked up from her drawing, her young voice cutting through the tension. Excuse me, Mr. Whitfield, but who are the serious business leaders? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison stammered, caught off guard by interrogation from a 10-year-old. I mean the people who understand traditional business principles, young lady. Like the people who didn't recognize that their taxi drivers were doctors and their janitors were professors. Emma's logic was devastating in its simplicity. Robert felt a surge of pride in his daughter's intellectual courage, but he also recognized the danger. This was the moment when he would either defend his transformation or retreat to old patterns of behavior. Emma raises an important point, Robert said, his voice gaining strength. The serious business leaders you're referring to are the same people who have been systematically wasting the most valuable resource in America, human intelligence. He stood and moved to the window overlooking Manhattan, the city that had shaped his old ambitions and was now witnessing his new purpose. 2 years ago, I would have agreed with everything you're saying. I would have prioritized short-term profits over long-term value creation. I would have dismissed Dr. Martinez-Williams's expertise because it didn't match my preconceptions about competence. And now, Harrison asked, now I understand that the companies and leaders who recognize talent regardless of its packaging will dominate the next decade. While we were arguing about whether my transformation was good for business, 3 of our competitors have launched their own talent identification programs based on our model. Margaret Thornton leaned forward. Which competitors? Sarah answered. Meridian Capital, Thornfield Industries, and Montgomery Holdings have all committed to similar initiatives. They're calling it authentic talent acquisition and positioning it as the competitive advantage for companies smart enough to look beyond traditional credentials. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The board members' own peers were adopting the strategies they were criticizing Robert for pioneering. Furthermore, Robert continued, the Richardson Martinez Centers have given our company access to a talent pipeline that our competitors can't match. We've hired 17 center graduates in positions ranging from architectural design to financial analysis. Their performance has been exceptional. Emma held up her latest drawing, a sketch of the boardroom that somehow captured the tension between old thinking and new possibilities. I drew everyone, she announced. But I could only make Mr. Whitfield and Ms. Thornton look serious by making them look sad. The childish observation contained profound truth. The defenders of the old order did appear diminished compared to the energy radiating from Robert and Sarah. Harrison made one final attempt to reassert traditional authority. Robert, regardless of the numbers, there's a question of appropriateness. Your personal relationship with staff has created an unusual dynamic that some consider inappropriate. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Robert felt his old anger rising, but Emma's voice cut through his emotion. Mr. Whitfield, she said with devastating clarity, are you saying it's inappropriate for people to become friends when they learn from each other? That's not exactly, because that sounds like you think smart people and rich people can't be friends. Which would be really sad, because then smart rich people like Daddy would be very lonely. The meeting ended with the board grudgingly approving continued funding for the centers, but Robert knew the real victory was different. He had faced pressure to abandon his transformation and chosen instead to defend it publicly. As the board members filed out, Harrison paused at the door, This isn't over, Robert. There are forces in this city that won't tolerate your disruption of traditional hierarchies. I'm counting on it, Robert replied. Revolution requires resistance. The ultimate test had been passed, but the war for a new vision of American capitalism was just beginning. 5 years after the charity gala that changed everything, the Richardson Mansion had become the unofficial headquarters of a movement that was reshaping American attitudes toward talent, wealth, and social responsibility. The grand ballroom where Robert once displayed his arrogance now hosted the annual conference of the National Hidden Talent Initiative, attracting business leaders, policymakers, and social innovators from across the country. Emma Richardson, now 13 and possessing an artistic sophistication that amazed professional curators, stood before an audience of 300 influential Americans, delivering the keynote address that her father had asked her to give. 5 years ago, my father was the richest and stupidest man in Manhattan, she began, her young voice carrying the confidence of someone raised on truth rather than flattery. He owned beautiful things without understanding beauty. He employed brilliant people without recognizing brilliance. He accumulated wealth without creating value. The audience listened with the focused attention reserved for profound truth, delivered with startling clarity. The night that changed everything started with him being mean to Sarah, Dr. Martinez Williams, in front of important people. But the real change happened when he decided to become a student instead of just a collector. Sarah watched from the front row, her eyes bright with pride for the child she had helped raise and the man she had helped transform. Beside her sat David Garcia, now director of the International Sustainable Agriculture Consortium, Maria Rodriguez, whose latest book on cultural intelligence had become required reading in business schools, and Carlos Fernandez, whose quantum computing research was revolutionizing multiple industries. Today, the Richardson-Martinez network operates in 47 cities, Emma continued. We've helped 347 qualified immigrants find positions that match their education and expertise. But the real success isn't in the numbers. It's in the recognition that genius exists everywhere, waiting for someone smart enough to notice it. Robert stood at the back of the ballroom, watching his daughter command the room with natural authority. The arrogant billionaire who had once dismissed his staff's brilliance had evolved into something unprecedented, a wealthy man whose influence grew from wisdom rather than dominance. The question people always ask, Emma said, is whether other rich people will follow my father's example. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, what will you do when you discover that the people you've been ignoring are smarter than you are? She paused, letting the challenge settle over the audience. Because you will discover it. Hidden talent isn't actually hidden. It's just ignored by people who confuse social position with intelligence. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Patricia Salinas, whose longitudinal study of the Richardson transformation had become the definitive academic work on adult behavioral change, took notes furiously. This child was articulating principles of social psychology with the clarity of someone who had lived them rather than simply studied them. My father learned that true wealth isn't what you own. It's what you understand, who you learn from, and how many people you help discover their potential. And once you understand that, accumulating money for its own sake becomes as silly as collecting art you can't appreciate. The audience erupted in applause, but Emma wasn't finished. The Hidden Talent Initiative has proven that America wastes its most valuable resource, human intelligence, because we're too lazy to look past our prejudices. That's not just morally wrong, it's economically stupid. Charles Morrison, now one of the initiative's primary funders, leaned forward. Emma's directness reminded him why disruptive thinking created the most successful companies. So here's my challenge to everyone in this room, Emma continued. Go home and look at the people you've been ignoring. The woman who cleans your office might have a medical degree. The man who drives your taxi might be an engineer. The teenager who serves your coffee might understand mathematics better than your accountants. And when you find that genius, not if when, you'll face the same choice my father faced. You can protect your ego by continuing to ignore them, or you can transform your life by learning from them. She smiled, and for a moment the sophisticated 13-year-old looked like the 8-year-old who had innocently triggered a revolution by showing her art to strangers. My father chose transformation. It made him happier, smarter, and more successful than he'd ever been when he was just rich. But more importantly, it made him worthy of the people who had been taking care of our family all along. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. But as the applause died down, Emma delivered her final insight. The most beautiful thing about recognizing hidden talent is that it reveals your own hidden potential. My father discovered he could learn. Sarah discovered she could teach. David, Maria, and Carlos discovered their knowledge could change the world. And I discovered that families aren't just created by blood. They're created by mutual respect and shared growth. Robert felt tears streaming down his face as he realized the full magnitude of what had been accomplished. His daughter had articulated not just a business strategy or social program, but a philosophy of human dignity that could reshape civilization itself. As the conference concluded, and participants networked around displays showcasing success stories from across the country, Robert found himself standing before the Monet painting that had once symbolized his empty materialism. But now he saw it through eyes trained by Sarah's expertise, understanding not just its market value, but its emotional truth. "Still your favorite piece?" Sarah asked, joining him. "Now it actually is," Robert replied. "Because now I understand what Monet was trying to capture, the beauty that exists when you learn to see clearly despite limitations." Emma approached with her latest sketch, a drawing that captured the entire ballroom during her speech, somehow managing to convey both the individual faces and the collective energy of transformation. "What will you title this one?" Sarah asked. Emma considered the question with artistic seriousness. "I think I'll call it The Day Rich People Learned to Listen." Robert laughed, recognizing in that title both his own journey and the larger movement it had spawned. The night that began with public humiliation had evolved into something unprecedented, a model for how wealth and power could serve wisdom rather than dominating it. Outside the mansion windows, Manhattan glittered with its eternal ambition. But inside these walls, a different kind of success had been achieved, one measured not in dollars accumulated, but in potential unlocked, not in status displayed, but in understanding shared. The transformation was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. Across America, hidden genius was stirring, waiting for recognition from people finally smart enough to see clearly. And in a world where wealth increasingly belonged to those wise enough to recognize talent in unexpected places, Robert Richardson had become exactly what he had always claimed to be, truly successful. The foundation had been laid for a new kind of American dream, one where everyone could be recognized for who they really were, rather than dismissed for who they appeared to be. The story that began with arrogance had concluded with authenticity, and the ripple effects would continue spreading for generations yet to come.